Should have practiced it, yes. Should have practiced this. Absolutely. Song is been multiple times.
No, that's definitely not the idea for this. You're rolling.
So, my friend, here we are. We're going to have a conversation, and we're doing this in part because we think it's important for Christians to have conversations with each other. And we have various books on our shelves, and they talk about spiritual companionship, Christian companions on the journey. And so that's what this is all about. So part of us doing this is to say to the people that we're talking to, people that we love, people that we lead, we're fired up about you having good, thoughtful, careful conversations. I want us to walk through Romans chapter 8. We've been studying that a little bit as a church, and Romans 8 feels like I've called it the engine room, sort of the center of the story. And so would love to be able to ask questions back and forth. The truth of the matter is that we do this just about every week.
All the time.
Yeah, it's back and forth, and we're trying to lead well, we're trying to teach well, we're trying to think well, and be understanding that the Lord Jesus is present with us. So.
And I find these conversations are, they're helpful for me, not only in understanding Bible, spirituality, faith more, but actually in articulating it more with other friends, and especially friends who don't share faith. So I'm hoping that these conversations will help people in our church have those kinds of conversations too, just listening to this.
Brilliant. It feels like God has kind of laid on our hearts more and more in the last number of, we went through COVID, but more and more people who are secular in their approach to life. Yeah. And we're like, how do we love you well? How do we have conversations that are meaningful to you? And we think super meaningful to God. So Romans 8, if we tackle this thing, it's like tackling a python or an elephant or something like that. But it's kind of fascinating because it begins with, there's no condemnation now for those of us in Christ Jesus. And it ends with, there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God that we have in Jesus. These sort of two declarations of what is not the case, right? And then, in a sense, what is the case, right? Yeah. What is the case, which is we are defined now by grace. Maybe help us understand a little bit that no condemnation piece, because that may or may not resonate with people in our time and day. And so some of it's historical, but I also think that some of, Romans 8 is also kind of universal. It goes across time.
Yeah, I don't know. I think our culture doesn't work with the language of condemnation too much. I mean, we do have people who would talk more about feeling ashamed or inadequate, but that feels like something different to me. I think that what Paul was talking about maybe more was people who were facing real condemnation. They were facing prison. They were being condemned by others in Rome who were saying that they were part of a cult, and so they were viewed with suspicion. And this was a real part of their lives. And Paul's saying that that's not true about you, what other people are saying. But I think you've said it's also related to Israel's history.
Right. And so I think what he pushes into, I don't know what is the second or third verse, and begins to talk about life in the flesh, right? And life in the spirit. There was this calling, fancy word, vocation that Israel had to live into being the nation that blessed other nations, right? And they never got around to it. And so, maybe we don't resonate with condemnation. That's not a language for us. They, I think, did. I think, Romans 8 follows Romans 7. You preached on it at one point, talking about doing the things that I don't want to do, not doing the things that I do want to do, and who's going to rescue me, this wretched man that I am. And so I think good scholarship has said this is a bit of a chronicle for not just my life and my own frustrations with my inabilities or my inconsistency, but also for Israel. This is a 1,000, 1,500 year story being compressed down. And so they did resonate with condemnation, didn't do our job, unfinished business. And maybe we can connect with some of that at some levels. So if we just walk a little bit through this passage, Paul does begin to talk about life in the flesh and life in the spirit. So, you've been a Christian leader for a long time, been a pastor for some years now, certainly carry the heart of this congregation close to your own. How do you see life in the flesh, life in the spirit? How does that play out in language that, the woman who lives across the street from you can understand?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a mystery, eh? I think that life in the flesh, and Paul talks about it in this chapter about our minds being consumed by things that are not good and true and beautiful. And so I think we see it, I see it in myself. I'm kind of controlled by things that I want or I think I need. That would be life in the flesh. Whereas life in the spirit, where our minds are focused on the things that God wants, which are beautiful and true and good. And we see that sort of unfolding more. It's not this sort of magic zap and we're transformed and we're suddenly these perfect people, but slowly the Spirit changes he actually changes our desires, right? And I think, isn't there a psalm that talks about that He'll give you the desires of your heart, and that's what He's starting to do. He's unfolding our hearts so that they actually want what He wants, and we become, over time, more and more loving, more patient, and more aware of the parts of us that are not in alignment with Him. That's what I would say. What would you say?
Well, I agree completely. I think we think of life in the flesh, and Paul was quite aware of what went on in Rome, and sort of the cults, the pagan sorts of things, the free-for-all, let your hormones do the thinking kinds of approach to life. What Paul was also aware of in his own life was like a religious life in the flesh, which we don't immediately think, because we think we're going to go to the church and everything that we do there is going to be good.
Right.
I'm going to start reading my Bible, and everything that I think reading my Bible or in my prayer life is going to be good. And it's actually thicker weeds, right? And all of a sudden I've got these, when you're drunk or whatever, you say, oh, no, probably shouldn't do that again. But when you're judging somebody else, you're feeling a little self-righteous about how many chapters of the Bible you read today, or the fact that they didn't do whatever. I gave this much money to the church. Then it's a blurry almost, right? And nobody knew that better than Paul. Paul knew that whole creature of having the appearance of church and spirituality, and actually it having nothing to do with the design of God, with the heart of Jesus. So when we talk about life in the spirit, we're just not talking about being spiritual people, because that's kind of attractive for most people in our day, or many people. We're actually specific to the Spirit of Jesus. So if I want to find out, am I living in spirit, then I'm reading my Gospels, and I'm watching Jesus, and I'm watching Jesus be gracious with sinners. Be kind, protect them, call them to new life. I'm watching Jesus actually be kind of sharp with religious people.
Right.
And this is part of life in the Spirit as well. Yeah, but I don't think we're supposed to feel like I'm on a tightrope. This is tough. I can't get this right. I sort of feel more like, once somebody calls that out, I don't have to chase my glands. I don't have to chase my physical whatever desires. And I don't have to get into this goofy, suffocating religious life either. Jesus actually, the way he lived his life was like, it was a football field wide of, this is what I can do within God's will. I think that's an important piece for me. So we have no obligation of the flesh. We have this beautiful obligation to rise into the calling of Jesus, right? I think Romans 7, 8, 9 talk about rising into what Jesus has for us. One of the things that happens in that front half of the book, Paul makes note of the fact that we're no longer slaves to fear. But then he begins to talk about adoption and sonship. Do you want to make any comment about slaves and fear and sonship and adoption?
Well, there's so much you could say. I think what I was thinking about more recently was it's interesting that he uses this idea of adoption and sonship, because it could sound sort of gender offensive, like why is it not more inclusive? But and I think you pointed it out in one of your sermons that sonship was so important in the culture that he was writing to, because, I mean, Caesars adopted their future heirs that way, so that there's this sort of royalty to it. But also it was the sons who would receive the full inheritance. And so it actually is including men and women in this kind of relationship where we get the full inheritance, the glory of, I think Paul uses the word, the glory of the reign of Jesus, and we're invited into that.
You and I had a conversation once about Abba, and how that, I mean, you can't dodge the Bible on it. This is the heart of God. He wants you to know this. But sometimes that's a bit of a hiccup.
Yeah, I think it is, because not everybody has had a great relationship with their dad. And so to try to imagine God as a father, for some people, I think it takes an extra couple of steps maybe. But I think that the heart is still that God wants to relate to us in this very intimate, close way, and the way a good father would, which is loving and protecting and wanting the good of the child, both now and in the future. I think about how, I think for my girls, my daughters, I want things that are good for them now, but also for the future. And so when I'm making decisions more when they were younger, it wasn't just for the present moment, but also what's going to be good for them long term. And I think that's the relationship that Paul is getting at here. And so using the word Abba, daddy, it's this very childlike word calling out to a father. I think it's available to all of us, but it just might take some more thought or work for some of us to use that. I don't know, what's your experience?
There's not a shortage of images in the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, of God in a mother role, right? Gathering the chicks and that sort of heart, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Jesus says, would that I could gather you together. So there's an agenda thing here, and you talk about what you and Brad would want for your girls, and near future, long term. That's what good parents would do, right? I mean, you can have chocolate cake for breakfast so many times, and then you're like, okay, maybe it's not best for the kids,
right?
But lots of fun, lots of plan for them. So one of the things that happens in the passage, and then I want to push on to what you were just talking about in terms of the future, is Paul talks about death being part of the experience still for Christians. And then also, he hints at resurrection, that the God who raised Jesus will also raise us. And so whether you're a Christian or a secular person, you've got this conversation with yourself, maybe with your friends, like, is there any meaning to my life? And wouldn't any future, like long-term meaning, be sort of what plays back into today and gives meaning to today? Because I think, if I understand it, you've done more reading on this than I have, but sort of the secular mindset is there is no meta meaning, no meta narrative, no big story about what's going on. You just have to find meaning in the day. You will find your own purpose and way for your own brief, albeit eternally insignificant life. But right, that's kind of the approach. And that
meaning is found in being happy. I think that's the other part of it, right? That the meaning, I think that if you drill down for many secular people, it would be you find meaning when you're happy.
Okay, that really spins this to Romans, the second half of Romans, where Paul talks really openly about suffering and how this is. You think, hey, God loves me. And Jesus died on the cross and he rose from the dead, so Easter, Easter, Easter every day. But there was no doubt in the early Christian mind, the early church's mind, we're going to suffer. We're going to suffer significantly. Not only are we going to have cancer and other, marriage break up at times and all sorts of things, financial collapse, the pipes will burst, my car will break down. Those things all happen. But we also understood, because Jesus told us, hey, pick up your cross, follow me. So how are you sorting suffering in your mind these days? You're sort of preparing yourself. How do you think about suffering as a Christian? You've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of it.
That's big. So I mean, it's such a big question, and it is one that everyone has to wrestle with because it's just inescapable. I think what we've both heard, I think it's Tim Keller talk about how our secular culture seems really poorly equipped to even think about suffering right now because so much meaning is found in happiness, and that is just not reality. And so when we bump into reality, we are not ready for it, and we're surprised, and we're looking for someone to blame. And so not at all equipped for it, whereas Jesus, like you've just said in the Bible, they're just absolutely realistic. You will suffer. You can expect this. And even though there are these great promises that he is for us, and he is with us, and he's working all things together for good, suffering is still part of the way somehow that he is unfolding the new creation. Maybe we can talk about that. But I think when it comes down to it, the best thing for me when I've encountered really horrific suffering, for example, in wars in Africa, they unsettled me. You know, how do you don't have a good answer for that. But the only thing that has started, it's not even that it makes sense, but the only thing I can look to is Jesus on the cross, because for whatever reason, suffering is a part of this world. God has decided that this is part of this world, and we don't understand all of the reasons, but he's also the only God who chose to enter the very worst suffering and to, out of love, to be a part of it with us. So he knows it himself, and if he's decided that it's worth it for him to go through that, for what is to come, then that gives me hope for the future. But I'd like to go back to what you were talking about resurrection, because I think you were saying some things in a recent sermon that are kind of surprising. I think you put it that Christians don't go to heaven. And I think this is part of how we handle suffering. So did you want to say more about that?
Right, so that's a bit unsettling, because most people have an impression, when I die I go to heaven. And I think without thinking it through, they adopt a Greek mindset, which is, 22, 24, 2,800 years old, that the body was bad and the soul was good, the immortality of the soul. And Christians have never subscribed to that, nor our Jewish predecessors, ancestors. They believed in the resurrection of the body, which is affirming for both the soul and for fingers and toes and for who we are. So right, this notion that we go to heaven, I hear it at funerals all the time. Big guy, you're up there, every shot is a three-pointer, every swish, every swing of the golf club's a hole in one. And we can't help ourselves, right? We can't help ourselves to sort of imagine this, what is, I think, Plato. I'm going to say Plato like I read the books, but I don't read the books. I just read people who read books.
Right, it's a good place.
Right, and he had this sort of image of life here as shadows, and then the reality was something deeper, spiritual. The amazing thing for Christians with resurrection, and it's rooted in creation, right, is that God made creation good, right? Zebras and bears and chipmunks, and God says good, right? Fish and birds, and God says good. Sun and moon and stars, God says good. Other creation stories from other religions were like, the creation's kind of a bit of a mistake. And gosh golly, what do we do with this mess of human beings? Some lopped off ancient pagan god's body part became the earth. But in the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition, man, this is good. Yeah. Really good, actually, when it's all put together. So it was not a surprise then that the Jewish folks and then Christians began to understand that God's heart was to make all things right in the end. So apart from, not me escaping, me having harp lessons in heaven, me growing angel wings, me polishing my halo, riding the clouds, not that, but new heavens and a new earth, and the dwelling of God will be with us here. We've been praying this for thousands of years, right? Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Bring that down here. Which I mean, this is a longer conversation, right? Because that was actually supposed to be the tabernacle initially, and the temple was this meeting place of heaven and earth. Yeah. And so when Paul says, he says it in 1 Corinthians, in Romans 12, he'll talk about you being a living sacrifice. all of a sudden, all of that Jewish notion that heaven was coming to earth at the temple, and then he says, and your body is the temple. Mm-hmm. It's like, hang on, what's that? So the intention was, and I think this is the point of Romans 8 too, is that heaven was going to come to earth here and now. You have this yes but not yet, yes and
now but not yet,
now but not yet, language, where it's like, that's starting. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually you're part of it. We're part of it, actually, more importantly, the church is part of it, instead of like my little story. We're going to do this. So resurrection for sure, I think, is what, as you kind of unravel or roll it back up, it makes sense today, because that's true. What was true about Jesus will be true about us. I think that was the language of the inheritance from the front, was what the Father has. The sons then, the what do you call them? Heirs. Mm-hmm. They have, whether woman or man, they have too, co-heirs with Christ. Okay, so how about, just to back to, I'd be a downer, talk about suffering all the time, but groaning, right? Uh-huh. In that second half, you'd think that Jesus comes back, right? Resurrection, and it's just all easy skating from here. You know, the slope is at least level, probably downhill. It's going to be easy. Yeah. But Paul didn't see that coming at all. There was going to be groaning. Creation was groaning. Christians were groaning. The Spirit's groaning. Do you have any thoughts on that as it pertains to suffering? Maybe it's even bigger than the suffering piece.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. The whole creation is groaning. And then there's this sense that we are groaning, waiting for the redemption of our bodies. But what I find so interesting in this passage, or I've been thinking a lot about, is the idea that the Spirit is groaning. And so we have this image of the Spirit when we are faced with, when we're faced with suffering or evil in some situations, like there just are no words. And in those situations, we don't even know how to pray. You don't even know how to talk to God about it. And yet the Spirit who is in us is groaning, is articulating that to God. And then there's this image of God who searches hearts. And I think it was N.T. Wright who said it's the word means, it conveys a picture of someone who's going through a large room that's dark and they're searching for something in particular. And so God is searching for this cry of the Spirit in us. And somehow that is part of God's redemptive plan for the world, that in suffering we are those who are praying and we're God's presence in the midst of suffering. It's a mystery. I don't understand it all. But it's beautiful.
We had read that there was this notion that the world was going to go to a golden age, that everything was going to be better, which isn't dissimilar to sort of notions that people even had at the turn of the last century. Everything was going to go roses. And back in that day, the Romans had understood that it would be them, through military conquest, they would usher in this golden age and all things would be good for everybody, but particularly the inner circle of Caesar and his buddies, right? Golden age. And Wright was the one, I think, that said the Jews had the same notion that things were moving towards a golden age, but they had this conviction that it was going to happen through suffering. Mm-hmm. Just stuff that the prophet Isaiah had said, and as they kind of added up their history, even something like a story of Joseph in prison, right? These stories where suffering actually became the means of God doing good things. Mm-hmm. The story of Israel's own slavery, and then out of that suffering came this new hope, promised land, right? That was what was going on. You're a little bit aware of what was going on in Rome circa 65 AD. And Paul would have been aware, Nero, and what was either Christians were beginning to experience or they started to get a little concerned they were going to be experiencing. Maybe it's just helpful just to throw that out there, the kinds of things that you've read and you're aware of and know just historically of what was coming their way.
Well, I mean, the Roman Empire was going to start to use, or was already starting to use, the Christian faith as kind of almost like a scapegoat. And so they, because they were a faith that that declared Jesus as Lord and not Caesar as Lord, they were kind of an easy target. And so they were tortured, and families were ripped apart. Parents, I just think of, parents who would have their children tortured or killed. Like, it was awful what these people were facing. They were encountering or about to encounter real suffering. The best case scenario would be prison. So this was very real for Paul. He'd been in prison a lot, but also for the Romans.
Yeah. So they were going to go. There's some question mark around whether the Christians actually featured in the Colosseum, if they were actually fed to lions. It certainly happened in other places. Nero is in history as rolling Christians, dead or alive, in tar, and then posting them around his garden, lighting them on fire for garden lights. It was horrific stuff. And as far as I understand it, the Christians in a city of 1 million or maybe a little bit more were up 100 of them.
Yeah, not
and
many.
They were in this sort of low-lying, poverty-stricken hovel, by the river, which was not great real estate. It had the tendency to overflow and wipe people's entire houses out.
Yeah.
So here's this 100 people that became the whipping boy, scapegoat, you called them, and yet here they are suffering, and then went through even worse. There was other folks that came along and tortured them, but within a couple hundred years, all of a sudden, Constantine comes to power, and the Christians are the show. The world was won over, not by the big muscles, not by military conquest of the Christians. The world was won over by
the way they died.
The way they died.
And suffered, yeah.
And loved people, and took care of not only their own poor, but the pagan poor. It was a stunning sort of, people started to add it up. These Christians are being treated horrifically, and they insist on being loving, right? They're not making some legal claim or lawsuit or suing anybody. They just would hold to this Jesus. I mean, this is the whole story, right? This Jesus piece. Okay. We're missing so much here.
Yeah.
But the end of Romans 8 has this fantastic assurance that not even all of these different things, life nor death, angels nor demons, height nor depth, no powers, nothing in all of creation can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. I don't know, maybe it's not fair, I didn't set you up for this well, but what does that mean for Lynnita Weber? What does it mean for you to carry about your day, be a pastor in a church, be writing a PhD, be mom to adult girls now, young women, live in Cannington? What does it mean for you to live with this certain assurance? There's nothing that you can face that will ever separate you from the love of God that we know in Jesus.
Well, I mean, it's a truth that I know in my head, and I need to keep reminding myself of it. But it's one that I think it's one of those truths that it takes time, and this is the work of the Spirit, for it to be part of my emotions and even in my body, if you will. So I have to keep reminding myself of that. I don't naturally wake up and think, wow, I'm loved. It takes discipline, actually, for me to be reminded of that. But again, it's beautiful. What the Spirit does is, over time, He raises this awareness. So more often in a day now, I will, when things are going well or when they're not going well, I will be reminded. It's this quiet voice that I'm loved no matter what, no matter how good things are. This is a great time to celebrate, and no matter how things are going sideways, I'm loved. Nothing can separate me from that love. Not my own, usually not my own mistakes or anything like that. It's that I like the language that Paul uses, that even in the middle of all of these things, and that was an audacious claim for him to be making, that I think some translations have more than conquerors, or we're more than victorious. We are actually so assured of God's love and of the victory that Jesus has already won over evil, over death, that we're actually more than victorious. We can kind of relax in it. But that's what it's like for me. What's it like for you?
It's not optimism, is it? It's not like,
No.
oh, it's a positive thinking and, it's going to be good. It's like all rooted in the person of Jesus. It's just that's the ground zero, that's the bedrock, the foundation, the cornerstone, capstone, whatever. He is the one. And so you ask about me. We've been to a few funerals recently, right? And so we realized some things. The chances are that I adore my wife like nobody on the planet. But one of us is going to put the other one in the ground, right? I'm definitely hoping that my 4 boys put me in the ground and I don't have to put any of them in the ground. But you start thinking, you can lose a lot of stuff in life, right? Precious, precious people, or your own health, or your job, or all sorts of things. And so what am I rooted and grounded in? What holds me together? And it's Jesus. Like that, I realized that I put all of my eggs in the Jesus basket. I don't have any backup plan. There's no kind of, well, if he doesn't pan out, then I guess I'll go here. Like it's all there. And so that relationship has just become so foundational, fundamental to me, more and more. Sometimes people talk about God, and that's cool. I get it. But I don't get God. I don't understand God in sort of the vague, big, people will talk about higher power way.
Right.
But when I drill down on Jesus and I watch him walk the dusty streets of Jerusalem, or I watch him engage a blind beggar or a rich tax collector or a woman who's been caught in a compromising situation. I watch him do that. And I go, man, if that's what God is like, man, you have my all. I would die for this. And I think that's what the early Christians were recognizing. I'm going to die for this. I think it's important to say, right? Romans 8 has this wonderful soaring feel to it. Like it's awesome. This is what people call it, like his Mona Lisa, Paul's masterpiece or opus. I'll start throwing out language I don't understand, but his best work. But the reality is that Romans 8 was written to Christians who were struggling. Why is this happening to me? I kind of thought, Jesus as Lord was going to be better than Caesar as Lord, but with Caesar, at least he would take our taxes, but we wouldn't have to suffer so much. But here's Jesus. Pull me into this. And there's this great promise, the Bible. This, I think, holds both of our lives together, this promise that Jesus wants to be near, wants intimacy. So like a Revelation 3:20, right? I'm knocking at your door. If anybody hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and have meal with them. Like that glues my life together. So wherever I am, if I preach a great sermon, I preach a lousy one, I'm crabby, I have to apologize for someone, be crabby. Or even something goes great, shockingly goes great, I get to root it back to Jesus. Jesus has had me and he's forming me into his likeness, and I got a calling on my life, and I'm invincible until the day of my death when he wants me with him, and I can rest settled with that. Okay, my friend, thank you for your time. It's fun. I just love to sit down and talk. This happens when I sit down with your husband, sits down when I talk with my wife. I know you've got these neat conversations that happen for you, and we just want to say more, Lord, of that, right? Let's be intentional about us doing our journey together. So that's episode 1 of what we haven't yet named, but might be the podcast called From the Cornfield here in Leesdale. And so we're hoping that this will be something that sparks, not just tuning in to listen to us talk, but your own conversations. And you could ask a neighbor, ask somebody here on a Sunday, not just so much about the Maple Leafs, but say, where's God speaking to you right now? Or here's what's going on in my life. Or did you resonate with what was said there? Because here's what I got from that. And these deep, sort of spirited, soul friend conversations.